Hello everyone and welcome to this review of For Honor. This game was released on the 14th and essentially this is a multiplayer focused medieval style of game. And this makes it really cool because the market at the moment is very not much made of this. Other than Chivalry, which was fairly popular but was a much more simplified and, let's face it, a much smaller budgeted game. So yeah, this is a very unfilled out niche in the market, and therefore seeing a AAA publisher, Ubisoft, kind of invest in this kind of focus, the medieval kind of focus of combat, is really cool. So let's get straight into it. What is the theme of this game then? It is essentially the ultimate board schoolboy dream where it's three super warrior kind of nations up against each other. You've got the samurai, you've got the Vikings, and you've got the knights. The only thing that's missing really from this collection is the Spartans, ninjas, and pirates. But maybe that will be the sequel title, I don't know. So yeah, this game contains a 7 to 8 hour long story mode as well as multiplayer, which chances are will be what you're going to be spending most of your time in. But regardless of that, the story mode is definitely not as bad as it could have been. I'm sure some of us were worried that this would just be a maybe 5 to 6 or 6 to 7 hour long mode with a tacked on awful story and unmemorable characters. Now, I would like to say that that's not largely the case. Thankfully, it is, as I said, 7 to 8 hours long. So this is slightly longer than most AAA campaigns nowadays. If you're overly familiar with the combat system already, maybe you played one of the betas before, the closed or the open beta, then maybe it'll take you slightly less time than that. Personally, I think I was around 7.5 hours to finish the story. If you're unfamiliar with the combat, or you just don't quite mesh with it, then it might take you a bit longer. Your mileage may vary, but somewhere between 7 and 8 hours, which I think is quite reasonable in this day and age of really short story modes. During the story, you spend time playing as these three characters from the three factions. You've got the Warden from the Knights, the Raider from the Vikings, and the Orochi from the Samurai. And essentially you get to play from starting out as the Knights, going into the Vikings, and then ending the story mode as the Samurai. And what exactly happens? Why are you playing? Well, essentially there's a main antagonist called Apollyon, who is this essentially evil, war-focused, fairly one-dimensional villain, I would say. And when you play as the three races, essentially you're just reacting to her diabolical schemes, and yeah, just trying to either stop them or survive them. And the combat in this game kind of works in a three-directional blocking and attacking way. So as I play the gameplay in the background, you will see that when an enemy attacks me, a red arrow kind of flashes from the direction that he is attacking. If he's attacking overhead, then a red arrow will flash overhead. Left or right, then a red arrow from left or the right. And what this means is that I can adjust my block stance to block that attack coming from that direction. So again, if he's attacking from the overhead, I can move my sword up the upward portion of the screen and I will automatically block it, assuming I block in time. Now there's also a parrying system, which means it's a more active form of blocking, so as well as moving your sword up to the right portion of the screen, when they attack from that direction, you also press whatever the button is for your system. On PC, it's right mouse button. I decided not to play with controller because I just whacked up all the sensitivities on my mouse and it seemed to work absolutely fine. So yeah, there you go. But yeah, if you press the button at the same time as the hit from the opponent comes in to hit you, then you can knock their sword aside and leave their guard open for you to then counterattack with some moves of your own and some combos of your own. Now this game does feature combos. So for the Warden, a very simple combo could be light attack, heavy attack. And what this means, if you're unfamiliar with the term from fighting games generally, essentially your attacks link into each other, which means that there's less downtime between each attack, which means that it's the optimal way of playing, because you'll get more damage in quicker and your opponent is much less likely to actually successfully defend against it, because it will just be that much quicker. So, speaking of the combat, the weight of the combat feels absolutely fantastic. When your swords clash with each other, you hear this clang, and both characters kind of recoil a little. If you're playing as one of the heavy characters, such as the Lawbringer, I believe it is, which you get to play in the Knights campaign, his polearm is extremely heavy, he's a slow character, and the character animation as well is very, very well done. The way the Knight kind of jogs along and his armor clinks and just like shuffles along with his jogs, the way he holds his sword or polearm or whatever weapon he's got, the slightly more nimble samurai movement, and the Vikings' kind of stompy, aggressive movements, it all works really, really well. And this is probably the best part of the game, not just the combat, but the way movement and controlling your character outside of and inside of combat, it all feels absolutely AAA, and that's definitely what I hoped for from this kind of medieval-focused kind of combat game published by a AAA publisher. It's fantastic. So, in the story mode, what works well? Well, first off, there's a diverse set of play that you can do. So, as well as playing through each of the factions in turn, starting with Knights, going into Vikings, then into Samurai, you also get to play several missions with a number of the different classes or heroes within each of the factions. So if I remember correctly, you get to play as, obviously, the Warden, him being the main character for the Knights, but also the Peacekeeper and the Lawbringer. You don't get to play as the Conqueror, and similarly in the other two factions you won't get to play as one of the classes, but getting to play 9 of the 12 classes that's definitely good, considering that this campaign is largely there to just prepare you mechanically for the combat in multiplayer. So another good thing that story mode does is that each of the factions feel very different in their focus and personalities. So the Knights very much focus on what is honor defined as to them. I'm trying not to spoil the actual story, so I'm going to be very vague on this point, but the Vikings, they focus on raiding in order to survive, and glory in combat, and the Samurai focus on duty, and it all works very well, for the most part. In particular for me, a highlight was in the Viking campaign, where, again, avoiding spoilers, there were a number of fairly silly moments where a Viking goes in solo to bravely attempt to do something by themselves, you know, capture a place or open a path forward, you know, completely by themselves against an entire garrison of troops, and they somehow survive, and then all the Vikings celebrate because, yeah, Vikings. And it's all very cool. It feels perfect for their faction's kind of style of being celebratory, glory in combat, Valhalla, all that good stuff. So what else features in the single player? Well, you can pick up power-ups, which is quite cool. These power-ups have limited uses, and I'm fairly sure all of them are just feats from the multiplayer. So when you're playing as the Samurai in the Samurai campaign, you can pick up a longbow style power-up, which allows you to shoot a dude with a flaming arrow, and that does a bunch of damage and sets them on fire for a short amount of time. Other power-ups include poison bombs for the Samurai. I honestly can't remember any of the Viking power-ups, but I'm sure there were some, and for the Knights, there were this Stalwart banner, which boosted your attack and stamina regen or something like that. There's also the classic feat from multiplayer, the Catapult, which throws a flaming great big blob of pain at an enemy, which is really cool. You don't get to use it often because it's absurdly powerful, but still, the addition of these power-ups in the story mode really does spice up the variety quite nicely, because otherwise it would have been entirely just sword against whatever weapon the other dude has. So I do really appreciate that inclusion. There's also observables in the environment, which are highlighted objects of interest that when you interact with them by pressing the appropriate button, it results in Apollyon's voice narrating that object and explaining something about it, maybe the overall story, how that relates to that object, her plans in general, or just the cultural significance of that object. Which is really quite cool because the voice actor behind Apollyon is really good. Fantastic job. She did a really good job considering that Apollyon is like this, not cold, but passionately slightly insane villain. Really good job there.
Do you know what kind of creature waits for its own slaughter? Sheep. Sheep.
And another point, the cutscenes in this game are rather pretty, and graphically in general, this is a modern looking game, so that's fantastic. You can also, whilst going around the single player mode, pick up this collectible steel currency, which, if you're unfamiliar, if you haven't played the betas, this currency can be used to unlock additional classes in multiplayer, as well as other customization options. So, that's pretty much a list of what worked in the single player, but what about what didn't? Well, despite the pickups, a lot of what you're going to be doing is the same style of combat. You're going to be hitting dudes with whatever weapon you have, using whatever combos your current class has, and you'll be doing it a lot. You'll be massacring millions and millions of the grunt troops, who will barely put up any fight, highlighted by occasional duels against the actually AI-controlled dudes, who will give you some fight. Occasionally there are boss battles of a sort, but still, if you don't enjoy that style of combat, then you definitely should not pick up this game because the single player is almost entirely made up of it. I'll also say that despite the factions feeling as their factions in my eyes should feel, there are definitely some characters in the story who are entirely forgettable, who barely get any lines in. You've got the Shugoki character for the samurai, who, despite doing a couple of cool things that I remember, he barely says anything, and as a result his character is very shallow. We don't know anything about him, we don't care about him at all. And the same can be said for the Conqueror character for the Knights campaign, and the Berserker character for the Vikings. It's a bit of a shame, but I guess in their defense, the campaign isn't crazy long, and spending the time to flesh out every character would certainly have added a few extra missions, extended the overall time by an hour and a bit, and yeah, the single player would definitely have improved as a result of that, but I guess they had to make some cuts here and there to release it at this time, so yeah, it's a bit of a shame, but regardless, that is a fact. Another fact though is that whilst swapping between characters who allow you to play as the different classes is nice in terms of variety, if you end up playing a section playing as a class who you just don't enjoy playing as, so personally for me, I didn't really enjoy playing as the Lawbringer because he's just really weighty and slow and his combos just felt really boring to me. That section in particular can get quickly tedious. Now, a few words of advice. If this happens and you end up playing as a character who you really don't enjoy, just start throwing people off of cliffs. It works, it's perfect, and it's highly enjoyable, and you will be very satisfied by the end. Forget, combos, just throw people off cliffs. It works, so do it. So, in summary then, the story does fairly well overall. It's lengthy enough, it feels reasonably satisfying to play through, and the conclusion, no spoilers here, is actually quite cool. Depressing, but cool. And it does really set up the scene for the multiplayer. So, in multiplayer, nothing huge has changed from the open beta as far as I can see, other than a few map additions that weren't in the beta, as well as extra customization options, executions, and things like that. Nothing serious has changed down in the actual gameplay of the modes. So, speaking of the modes, you've got Duel, which is the 1v1 as you would expect duel mode, which is you against the opponent. No extraneous factors, no extra opponents coming in to make it a 2v1, no soldiers to worry about like clogging your movements, no objectives outside of murder your opponent, which I have to say is one of my favourites, up there with Dominion. Speaking of Dominion, this is a 4v4 mode, which I have covered in a previous video in great detail and given my thoughts, so feel free to go watch that if you want more in-depth coverage, but that is 4v4, control points around the map, and AI soldiers in the middle lane. A very objective-focused mode where oftentimes just murdering the opponents is not as important as capturing another point for your team. Then the other 4v4 mode you have is Elimination, which again forgets all of the objectives, all of the AI, and just pits 4 players on each team against each other. This is actually quite interesting because if one player very quickly beats their opponent, then they can go run across the map and help someone on their team beat their opponent in turn, which can very quickly snowball out of control. So that's really quite interesting mechanically. And then you've got Brawl, which is a 2v2 mode similar to Duel, where it's one player against one player on one side of the map and one player against one player on the other. But similar to Elimination, if one of the players is really weak or really strong, then that can heavily impact the performance of the other player. As if, say, your teammate is extremely good and they thrash their opponent within a few seconds and very quickly murder him, they can just jog across the map and make it a 2v1 against your opponent, and really swing the whole thing in your favour. So, each time you win a match in For Honor multiplayer, you can then spend the war assets that you earn from the win on the faction map. Okay, so the faction war. So if you go into multiplayer, the lobby, which can be found just there in the main menu, you can see in the top right how the Vikings are storming ahead of the samurai and the knights, with the knights being in the middle of the pack, although way behind the Vikings, and the samurai being just behind the knights. So if you look at these portions on the map, you will see how the Vikings are up in the north, the samurai are down in the southeast, I think that is. Never eat shadowed wheat. Yep, that's the one. And the knights are in the west. So essentially, you can see how the Vikings winning so much has led to them gaining all of this land here, whereas the knights, we're kind of holding our own, not doing too badly, and the samurai are pretty much in the same boat. And what this means is when you finish a match, you will earn some war assets, and you can choose to just skip to the next match immediately, in which case the game will automatically throw all of your war assets at all of your factions' kind of, I don't know, provinces, I guess I would call them. Provinces, states, something like that. Which is obviously not good because it's not a focused kind of use of your war assets, but if you choose to spend your war assets on a specific province, then you will kind of boost your faction's progress in that province. You can choose to defend. So if I was the samurai, I could choose to defend, this province, that province, those ones there, any of these. Or I could choose to offensively use my war assets in these provinces held by the knights, or these provinces held by the Vikings. It's a cool system. It gives you just an extra thing to think about when you're playing, more than just, hey, this is just a multiplayer lobby screen. And yeah, it's pretty cool. So you've also got some extra things such as these contract orders, which can be found here. So when you first start multiplayer, these 3 will be empty and you'll be told to choose some contract orders. Now, when you complete these are simple challenges. So look, perform 10 honorable kills in elimination matches, player versus player. And sometimes it'll be player versus AI, which are very easy to do because, you just stomp the AI and get that experience and steal. But yeah, it's just, again, another thing to kind of think about when you're playing multiplayer, other than, hey, one match, the other match, this match, so on and so forth. It's just quite cool. It's not a big deal. It's a chance to level up your character slightly quicker and gain more steal, so yeah, it's not a bad idea. In multiplayer, there are also feats, which, similar to the power-ups in single player, they are part of the customization system, which allow you to kind of tailor your chosen hero or class to how you want to play. There are certain faction-specific feats. For the knights, you've got the catapult, which launches a very powerful kind of AoE effect at an area. Now these are level 4 feats, which are naturally the most powerful. As you play through a match, if feats are enabled as an option in the game, you will, the more objectives you do, unlock your feats by leveling up. So your level 1 feat will naturally be much weaker than your level 4 feat, and the level 1 feat will often just be a passive. So for the Warden, most of the time that will be the gain health and stamina when you kill an AI grunt, which is naturally very useful if you want to spend a bunch of your time in the mid lane in Dominion mode. So speaking of customization in this game, when you first play, it will instruct you to make an emblem for your account, I guess, which is really cool. For each of the factions, it's a different shape of shield, which you can then make a background color, an emblem, an icon on the top. It's a really cool system, and coupled with the extensive patterns, colors, and engravings, and tattoos, and things like that, that are also available for your characters. Yeah, it's just a really well fleshed out system. You can choose different color schemes, unlock different color schemes, and yeah, it's a good system. It, again, along with the contract orders and the faction war, it just fleshes out the multiplayer really quite nicely. Because all of this is alongside the actual learning of classes and improving your play. So it's a very fleshed out multiplayer game, and yeah, considering that the multiplayer will be the focus of this game, that's a very good thing. So this in-game currency steal, what it can also do is unlock new classes. So each of the classes, other than the 3 starting classes, the Kensei, the Warden, and the Raider, other than those 3 starting classes which are unlocked from the start, you can unlock all the others using 500 steel. Now, given that, if you finish the story mode on hard, which was my experience, you gained upwards of 7,000 steel from that. 500 steel for a class is not too bad a price. However, I do have a couple of nitpicks, one being that I wish there was a demo system in this game other than the single player, because since this game is sort of charging you for everything that you want to unlock, despite the price being fairly reasonable, 500 steel is not a huge amount really, I would still feel much better about my class purchases, and I think many people would, if there was a tryout system, so you could play against an AI in duel maybe, with a class that you have not unlocked yet, just to see if you really want to spend steel on unlocking it. I feel like a feature like that would only improve player knowledge and experience with the classes and allow them to make more informed choices. Another big issue that I have with the game at the moment is the connectivity status symbol. So essentially in-game, this is a word in the top left corner of your menu that indicates your connection quality. So there's a green, yellow, red, traffic light system. Green is a good connection, yellow is a middling connection, and red is an awful connection. There is also the open, medium, and strict connection words, which will be coloured in the green, yellow, red system. If you've got an open NAT connection, then yeah, fantastic. And naturally, if you've got a strict red NAT connection, then that's just like the absolute worst. What I don't like about this system is that, firstly, it's extremely inconsistent. So sometimes I am red and strict, which is, the absolute worst, and sometimes, absolutely randomly, I am green and open. Does that make any sense? Not really to me. So how does this impact your multiplayer experience? Well, it limits what games you can join, and also, therefore, limits the amount of the player base that you will actually have access to. So despite there currently being, 40,000 plus players on PC, I can only play with so many of them if I'm strict kind of status. And this means that it takes much longer to find a game. Admittedly, when you do find a game, even as, red and strict, the bottom of the barrel, the match itself is fine, and lag is rarely an issue in my experience. The real problem, however, is that unless you played in one of the betas for this game, you have no real idea of which side of the line your connection is going to be. Despite me having little to no issues playing other multiplayer-focused titles, For Honor seems to find it much harder to get me into any matches. So for a multiplayer focused title, this is a huge deal, and I know for a fact that a lot of players have also experienced this issue in the open beta. Given that you have kind of lost your chance to see if your connection will work with this game, I would be very careful purchasing this title, because you just don't know if the connection you're given is going to be good enough for this arbitrary system that the game uses for kind of assigning you your status. So in summary then, this game, mechanically and content-wise, certainly does a lot right. The combat is satisfying, weighty, and more complex than previous entries in this genre, and character movement feels and looks realistic without being awkwardly slow. Executions are really cool to pull off, and beating another player in a 1v1 fight to the death is an absolute blast. The story mode as well could have been an entirely throwaway addition, with minimal effort put in, but instead it is a decent length, prepares you fairly well for multiplayer, and features several epic moments that are absolutely worth the playthrough. Likewise, the multiplayer includes enough modes and classes to not get boring in a hurry, and the expansive customization only adds to how much time you could end up investing in this game long term. The only major issue I have with the game though is the unreliable connectivity, which for a multiplayer focused game is such a big issue. Whilst some people claim to have found fixes for this problem, I refuse to accept that in this day and age the only way I can get a good connection to this game is by forwarding several ports, contacting my network provider, and turning off all of my firewalls. It's absolutely ridiculous. As a paying player, I should not have to be the one jumping through hoops to play the game well. That should be the developer's responsibility. It's down to them optimizing their game's connectivity or whatever network status. They need to work on this. Hopefully they can find a long-term practical fix, as this really does need to be addressed. But other than that, it's a fantastic game, and if you're confident in your internet, then by all means I would recommend it if you find this style of combat really appealing, which personally I definitely do. So that's pretty much it for my review. I do hope it helped inform you of the pros and cons of this title, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.